This was the sound of an army dying, not with a roar, but with a whisper, the endless, hissing whisper of arrows falling from the sky. For 7 days it was the only sound 12,000 Crusaders knew. Trapped on a narrow coastal road, surrounded by 30,000 of Saladin's warriors, they were being systematically bled white. Heatstroke, thirst, and a constant rain of Turkish arrows were picking them apart. They were marching ghosts, their discipline the only thread holding them together. But on September 7th, 1191, that thread snapped. And in the terrifying silence that followed, a new sound emerged. The roar of 2,000 knights unleashing 7 days of pent-up hell. What happened next in the olive groves near Arsuf wasn't a battle. It was a 17-minute massacre that defied all logic. A 10-to-1 kill ratio. 700 Crusader dead against 7,000 of Islam's finest soldiers. This is the story of how Richard the Lionheart turned certain defeat into one of the most lopsided victories in military history. We'll uncover why he waited until his men were on the brink of mutiny, how a single moment of lost temper changed everything, and why Saladin's greatest tactical strength became the very reason for his catastrophic downfall. The secret weapon wasn't a new sword or a secret alliance. It was something far more powerful, the psychology of patience and the devastating power of a single, perfectly timed strike. The air in the Levant in the summer of 1191 was thick with more than just heat. It was thick with consequence. The monumental 2-year siege of Acre was over. The city, a crucial strategic port, had finally fallen to the forces of the Third Crusade. This was not just a military victory, it was a psychological lifeline for Christendom. Just 4 years earlier, the disaster at the Horns of Hattin had led to the loss of Jerusalem itself. The sacred true cross, the most revered relic in the Christian world, had been captured. The Crusader kingdoms were on the verge of being wiped from the map. The fall of Acre was a signal that the tide might, just might, be turning. At the center of this hope was a man who was already a legend, Richard I, Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou. At 33 years old, he was a paragon of the warrior king ideal. He stood well over 6 feet tall, a giant in an age of small men, with fiery red-gold hair and a reputation for breathtaking personal courage, and a tempestuous, often ruthless nature. But he was far more than a brawler. He was a meticulous planner, a master of logistics, and one of the most innovative military tacticians of the Middle Ages. He had taken command of the stalled siege of Acre, and through a combination of relentless assault, brilliant engineering, and his own force of will, he had broken it. Now the real challenge began, the march to reclaim Jerusalem. But watching from the eastern hills, a man every bit his equal studied the Crusader host, Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria. His name, Saladin, meant righteousness of the faith. He was a Kurdish warrior who had risen to unite the fractured Muslim world under his banner. Where Richard was fiery, Saladin was often calm and calculating. He was a master of political maneuvering and a practitioner of a very different kind of war. His victory at Hattin was a masterpiece of patience, deception, and environmental warfare. He had lured the Crusader army into a waterless trap and destroyed it. He now held Jerusalem. He believed the fall of Acre was a temporary setback, a pinprick, He still held the interior lines, he still commanded the loyalty of dozens of emirs, and he still possessed the larger, more mobile army. Thus, the stage was set for one of history's most fascinating military duels. Richard now faced his first grand strategic decision. The ultimate goal, the spiritual and political prize, was Jerusalem, which lay inland. The romantic, glory-seeking choice would have been to strike directly for it, to ride the wave of momentum from Acre. Many of his knights and nobles pressured him to do just that. But Richard the Gambler was also Richard the Strategist. He looked at a map and saw the peril. A direct march inland would stretch his supply lines for dozens of miles through hostile territory. His army would be a slow-moving target, constantly harassed, its foraging parties ambushed, its morale eroded. Saladin would get the war of attrition he desired. So, Richard made the calculated, unglamorous, and brilliant choice. He would march his army south, down the Mediterranean coast to the port city of Jaffa. His fleet, a vital asset, could sail alongside, providing a floating warehouse of food, water, and siege equipment. It secured his supply line and gave him a potential escape route. It was the safe, logical, and predictable move. And Saladin was counting on it. When his scouts confirmed the Crusaders were taking the coastal road, the Sultan allowed himself a smile. The 80-mile route from Acre to Jaffa was a geographical gift from Allah. To the west, the impassable sea. To the east, a long, unbroken line of wooded hills, sandy ridges, and dense scrubland, perfect terrain for ambush. The Crusaders would be channeled into a narrow corridor, sometimes less than a mile wide. There was no room for grand maneuvers, no open flanks to protect. They would be a slow, fat target, and Saladin's army held the high ground. It was the perfect killing ground. But this was not a duel between a blind man and a seeing man. It was a duel between two grand masters. Richard had spent his life in the study of war. He knew the accounts of Hattin intimately. He understood Saladin's reliance on skirmishers, feigned retreats, and attacks on supply lines. Saladin, in turn, had spent the siege of Acre interrogating every captured knight and mercenary. He knew of Richard's reputation in France for both ferocity and a surprising level of chivalry. He knew the English king was a master of the set-piece battle, where discipline and heavy cavalry decided the day. Each commander understood the other's preferred method of combat. The coming week would be a test of who could force the other to fight on their worst terms. As Richard's 12,000-strong column, a mix of hardened knights, disciplined monastic warriors, and steady infantry, began its deliberate march south on September 3rd, Saladin's vast host, a swirling cloud of 30,000 horsemen and foot soldiers, shadowed them from the ridges. The most psychologically grueling week of the entire Third Crusade was about to begin. To truly grasp the miracle of Arsuf, one must first understand the instruments of war that were about to collide. They were not just two armies, they were representations of two entirely different military philosophies, one reaching back to the classical past, the other pointing toward the future. Richard's force was a compact, professional, and incredibly expensive instrument of war. Its total number, around 12,000, was small, but it was a masterpiece of quality over quantity. At its heart were the 2,000 mounted knights. These were not merely soldiers. They were the medieval equivalent of armored divisions. Each was a walking fortress. His primary armor was a long chainmail hauberk, a shirt of interlinked iron rings that could weigh over 40 pounds. Over this he might wear a surcoat to deflect the sun's heat. His head was protected by a great helm, a cylindrical pot of steel that offered tremendous protection, but limited vision and ventilation to a few small holes. He carried a massive, kite-shaped shield, a 12-foot lance of ash wood for the initial charge, and a heavy, double-edged broadsword for the brutal work of the melee. His horse, a massive destrier, was itself a weapon, bred for strength and aggression, and often armored on its head and chest. Among these knights were the elite of the elite, the military orders, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Knights Templar. These were not feudal lords fighting for personal glory and land. They were warrior monks, bound by strict religious vows that included absolute obedience. They had no families, no lands to inherit. Their only loyalty was to their order, their faith, and their commander. This made them the most disciplined and reliable troops on the battlefield. Their ability to hold formation under extreme pressure was the stuff of legend. The Templars, in particular, were known for their fanatical courage. Their rule forbade them from retreating unless outnumbered at least 3-1. They were the unbreakable steel spine of Richard's army. Supporting this corps of heavy cavalry were roughly 10,000 infantry. These men are often the forgotten heroes of the Crusades. About half were spearmen or sergeants. Their job was to form a mobile, protective wall around the vulnerable knights and horses. They marched with large shields, often overlapping them to create a testudo-like formation that could deflect arrows. Their long spears, or bills, bristled outward, creating a defensive hedge that was terrifying for cavalry to charge. The other half of the infantry were the crossbowmen. Their weapon was the medieval precision rifle. It was slow to load. A skilled man might get 2 shots off in a minute, but it was terrifyingly powerful. A steel-tipped quarrel could punch through chainmail and even the thinner parts of plate armor at 200 yards. They were the great equalizer against the faster-shooting but lighter Turkish bows. These men were often professionals, paid wages, and their steadying presence was crucial. But Richard's true genius lay not in the individual components, but in how he assembled them. He was a master of drill and discipline. He organized his army into a specific, relentless marching formation, a long, dense column. The Knights Hospitallers, under their master Guernier de Nablus, typically led the vanguard. Richard and his royal banners, his household knights, and the central battle standards commanded the center. The Knights Templar, under their master Robert de Sablé, held the critical and often most dangerous position, the rear guard. The vital baggage train, with the army's food, water, and siege equipment, was kept between the infantry and the sea, protected by the fleet sailing just offshore. The entire formation was a slow, methodical, and incredibly disciplined box of death. Its strength was its unity, its interdependence. To break the formation was to break the army. Richard's command was absolute. Hold the line, no matter the provocation. Facing them was Saladin's host, a vast, fluid, and multicultural force of approximately 30,000 men. Its greatest asset was its strategic and tactical mobility. The heart of his army was the Mamluk cavalry. These were not feudal levies. They were slave soldiers, purchased as boys, often from the Turkish steppes, and trained from childhood in the arts of horsemanship, archery, and warfare. They were the special forces of the medieval Islamic world. They wore lighter armor than their Crusader counterparts, often layers of silk and cloth under a coat of mail or lamellar armor, which allowed for incredible speed, endurance, and flexibility. Each Mamluk often had 3 or 4 horses, allowing them to rotate their mounts and remain fresh, while the Crusaders' single, heavier horses wore down. Their primary weapon was the composite recurved bow, a technological marvel crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew. It was shorter than the English longbow, but could fire with astonishing speed and power, capable of launching up to 12 arrows a minute from a moving horse. They were masters of the caracol tactic, riding forward in a swirling, seemingly disorganized mass, unleashing a devastating cloud of arrows, and then wheeling away before the slower Crusader crossbows could draw a bead on them. For close combat, they carried a light lance, a round shield, and a curved scimitar, perfect for slashing cuts from horseback. They were joined by thousands of other troops, Bedouin light cavalry, expert in scouting and guerrilla tactics, Turkmen horse archers from the steppes, and Kurdish and Egyptian infantry, who were skilled with the bow and spear, but were generally considered less reliable than the cavalry in a set-piece battle. Saladin's strategy was not built on seeking a single decisive clash of heavy forces. It was a strategy of systemic erosion, of 1,000 cuts. His real weapons were psychological. The constant, maddening drizzle of arrows was designed not to kill en masse, but to wound, to torment, to kill valuable horses, and most importantly, to break the enemy's spirit. The relentless thunder of war drums and the piercing clash of cymbals were used to create a sense of overwhelming chaos and dread, to disrupt sleep and communication. His troops would kick up enormous clouds of dust to obscure vision, disorient the enemy, and hide their own movements. He sought to lure the Crusaders out of their protective formation, to provoke them into a reckless, disorganized charge. Once they were scattered and exhausted in the open, his faster, more numerous cavalry would surround them, cut off their retreat, and destroy them piecemeal, just as they had done to the overconfident King Guy at Hattin. It was a strategy that played to all his strengths and exploited the known weaknesses of the Franks, their impatience, their heavy armor in the heat, and their cultural obsession with the glorious charge. The stage was set. The anvil, the disciplined, heavily armored anvil versus the swift, swirling storm. And the anvil upon which they would meet was the narrow coastal plain near the town of Arsuf, a place of sandy soil, dense orchards, and little room for error. The Crusader column began its fateful march on September 3rd. From the outset, Richard imposed a pace that seemed like madness to his men and a profound mystery to his enemy. A deliberate, grinding pace of just 10 miles a day. He was not running from the fight. He was controlling it. He was forcing Saladin to come to him, on his terms. He was preserving the strength of his men, and, most importantly, the integrity of his formation. Every mile not marched was a mile of strength preserved. Every hour Saladin spent shadowing them was an hour his own army grew more frustrated and consumed its supplies. Day 1, the whistle of death. The first signs of the enemy came within hours. Shadows appeared on the eastern ridges, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Then came the sound, a faint, high whistle that grew into a deadly, hissing chorus. The first arrows began to fall. They were not concentrated volleys, but a constant, harassing fire, like a deadly rain. The Crusader discipline was immediately tested. Knights, whose entire culture in training was built on the aggressive, decisive charge, had to sit on their horses, enduring the dull, jarring thuds of iron-tipped arrows slamming into their shields and armor. The order was absolute, relayed by sergeants and priests up and down the column. Hold the line. No one charges. The signal for the charge will be 3 trumpet blasts. Any man who breaks ranks will be executed. Richard himself was a constant, galvanizing presence, riding up and down the line on his great war horse, a figure of stoic resolve. He was seen pointing to the enemy, laughing and shouting encouragement. "Let them waste their arrows on our shields," he was reported to have said. "Our time has not yet come. Their pride will be their downfall." Day 2 through 4. the pressure cooker. The following days saw the pressure intensify relentlessly. The attacks grew bolder and more coordinated. The Muslim cavalry came closer. Their taunts and war cries in Arabic and Turkish added a psychological layer to the physical torment. "Where is your God now, Franks? You will all die here, in the dust." The heat of the late Levantine summer became a weapon in itself, an enemy more persistent than any Saracen warrior. Temperatures soared well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men marching in full armor were slowly cooking inside their metal shells. The chainmail, heated by the sun, became a scalding skin. Inside the great helms, it was a suffocating dark oven. Thirst became a constant, agonizing companion. Water was strictly rationed. The few wells and streams along the route were in enemy-controlled territory or had been poisoned. The rearguard, held by the Templars, bore the brunt of the assault. They developed a brutal, exhausting drill to counter the attacks from behind. They would often have to ride backwards in their saddles, presenting a solid wall of shields and leveled lances to their pursuers, while their squires and sergeants led their horses forward. It was a humiliating and draining posture, a testament to their incredible discipline, and it held the line. The crossbowmen did their work, their heavy bolts taking a steady toll on the overconfident Muslim horsemen who ventured too close. A well-aimed bolt could punch through a rider's shield and armor, unhorsing him in a spray of blood. But every bolt fired was one less in the dwindling supply. Saladin's archers seemed to have an endless supply of arrows, brought up by camel trains from Damascus and Cairo. Day 5, 6, the breaking point. By the 5th day, the army was a single, massive, coiled spring, wound to its absolute limit. The landscape was littered with the corpses of horses and the occasional knight who had succumbed to a lucky shot through a visor or a joint in his armor. The shields of the infantry looked like porcupines, bristling with dozens of arrow shafts. Men marched in a daze of exhaustion, heatstroke, and suppressed rage. The noble lords grumbled in their tents at night. The common soldiers whispered in fear, seeing omens in the flight of birds. The stench of death, sweat, and horse manure was overwhelming. The master of the Hospitallers, Garnier de Nablus, was a man being pushed to the very edge of his sanity. He was a warrior, not a pacifist. He watched his brothers, men sworn to a holy cause, the best knights in the world, being picked off one by one, dying without being able to strike a single blow in return. His knights, men of violent profession and pride, were coming to him, begging, demanding for the chance to fight back, to avenge their fallen comrades. Reports reached Richard that the men were at their limit, that some of the lesser knights and sergeants were speaking of charging with or without orders, preferring an honorable death in combat to this slow, ignoble martyrdom. Yet, Richard held firm. His will was iron. He rotated units, moving fresher men from the van to the most battered positions in the rear, but he would not increase the pace. He would not give Saladin the disordered, frantic, running battle he so desperately wanted. He was absorbing punishment, letting Saladin's army exhaust itself, waste its arrows, and, most importantly, grow overconfident. He was waiting for the one perfect moment to unleash a counterblow that would be all the more powerful for having been restrained for so long. He was turning his army's suffering into potential energy, like drawing back a giant crossbow, storing immense force for a single, devastating release. Day 7. The trap is sprung. September 7th. The Crusader army was within striking distance of Arsuf, where a fortified camp and resupply from the fleet awaited. Saladin, a brilliant commander in his own right, realized his strategy of pure attrition was failing. The Crusader formation had not broken. Their discipline had held. He could not allow Richard to reach the safety of Arsuf, regroup and solidify his coastal supply line. The Sultan made a fateful decision. Today would be the day of decisive battle. He would commit his entire army, risk everything to crush the Crusaders once and for all. As dawn broke, the Crusaders saw a sight that must have chilled their souls despite the heat. The hills were not dotted with small bands of skirmishers. They were black with massed ranks of soldiers, a dark, shimmering line that stretched for miles. Saladin had deployed his full force in a classic battle array. His nephew, the brilliant and aggressive Taqi al-Din, commanded the right wing, threatening the Crusader van and the Hospitallers. The left wing, under other trusted emirs, pressed hard against the Templar rearguard. And in the center stood Saladin himself, surrounded by his personal guard and the absolute cream of his Mamluk cavalry, the Askar. The plan was clear and devastating. A massive coordinated hammer blow to smash the rearguard, sow panic, and roll up the entire Crusader column from the back forward. The assault began around 9 a.m. It was unlike anything the Crusaders had experienced in the previous 6 days. This was not harassment. This was an all-out attempt at annihilation. A storm of arrows so dense it literally blotted out the sun, darkening the sky. Thousands of cavalry, not just shooting from a distance, but charging in with drawn sabers and lances, trying to physically break the shield wall. The war drums reached a deafening, mind-numbing crescendo, a physical pressure on the eardrums. The pressure on the Hospitaller rearguard became unbearable. Men and horses fell in heaps. The line began to bend. The air was thick with the screams of the dying, the shouts of commanders, the whinnying of terrified horses, and the relentless, maddening beat of the drums. Then Saladin played what he believed was his MasterCard. Taqi al-Din himself, a prince of the realm and one of Saladin's best commanders, led a personal charge aimed directly at the Hospitaller standard. It was a direct, personal insult, a challenge to their honor that was, in the chivalric code, impossible to ignore. For Garnier de Nobles, it was the final straw. 7 days of torment, of watching his men die unavenged, of swallowing his immense pride, exploded in a volcanic, uncontrollable surge of rage. "St. George!" he roared, his voice cutting through the din like a blade. "Now we shall see who is the true knight." Without waiting for the trumpet, without orders, in a flagrant violation of the king's direct command, he lowered his lance, spurred his massive warhorse, and charged. The 300 Hospitaller knights, their legendary discipline finally snapping under the weight of collective fury and loyalty to their master, followed him as one. It was a glorious, heroic, and potentially catastrophic breach of orders. The entire meticulously crafted battle plan was unraveling in an instant of pure human emotion. From his position in the center, Richard the Lionheart saw the Hospitallers break formation. In that moment, a lesser commander would have seen only disaster, the collapse of his entire strategy. But Richard was a gambler of the highest order. He saw not disaster, but opportunity. The premature and disordered charge of the Hospitallers had done what his own patience could not. It had fully committed Saladin's army to the fight. The Muslim troops, seeing a part of the Crusader line surge forward, would believe the Franks were finally breaking, that their patience had finally failed. They would surge forward in turn, closing the noose, believing victory was at hand. The trap was sprung, just not in the way Richard had planned. Now was the moment. The moment to turn a breach of discipline into the first blow of a general counteroffensive. He had mere seconds to decide. To recall the Hospitallers was impossible and would leave them isolated and slaughtered to a man. To do nothing was to watch them be destroyed and his rearguard collapse. There was only one path forward: total commitment. He turned to his trumpeter, his face a mask of grim determination, and gave the order. The sound that every crusader had been praying to hear for 7 agonizing days tore through the cacophony of battle. 3 long, clear, piercing, and unmistakable blasts. What happened next was one of the most devastating and coordinated displays of shock combat in the history of warfare. It was not merely a charge, it was a detonation. The entire Crusader line seemed to erupt at once. After 7 days of perfect, stoic defense, they shifted to a perfect, thunderous, and synchronized offense in a matter of heartbeats. The Hospitallers on the right, already in motion, smashed into Taqi al-Din's wing with the force of a geological event. They were not just fighting, they were exercising 7 days of rage. Garnier de Nobles was a man possessed, his lance striking down the first Saracen horseman he met, then drawing his sword and carving a path directly towards the enemy command. Almost simultaneously, the Templars on the left, having endured the worst of the march and possessing a discipline even more rigid than the Hospitallers, did not break into a disorganized mob. They pivoted as a single, monolithic unit. Their charge was not one of rage, but of cold, calculated precision. They swung out and then inward, like a giant steel door slamming shut, hammering into the exposed flank of the Muslim forces, who were now pressing the center. And in the center, Richard the Lionheart himself became the spearhead. A giant of a man on a massive destrier, he led his household knights, his English and Norman barons, in a direct, brutal assault on the very core of Saladin's army. He was unmistakable, his royal surcoat and banners marking him as the prime target and the greatest inspiration. Eyewitness chroniclers describe him as being everywhere at once, his great sword rising and falling in a rhythm of death, dealing blows that could cleave a man from shoulder to saddle. The psychological impact on the Muslim army was instantaneous and total. Moments ago, they were the hunters, confident, riding almost with impunity. Now they were faced with an avalanche of steel and fury they could never have anticipated. The ground shook under the coordinated hooves of 2,000 charging war horses, a sound like continuous thunder. The air, once filled with Turkish war cries and drums, was now rent with the Latin and French battle cries of Deus Vult and St. George for England. The physics were brutal and unforgiving. A fully armored knight on a charging destrier was a missile of immense kinetic energy. Their 12-foot lances struck first, splintering on impact, with a sound like cracking ice, but often not before driving straight through shields, armor, and the men behind them. The lighter Muslim cavalry, bred for speed and agility, simply could not withstand the sheer mass and momentum of the impact. Their line didn't just break, it disintegrated into a chaotic mass of falling men, screaming horses, and panicked riders trying to flee. The discipline that had held the Crusaders together for 7 days now made their charge utterly unstoppable. They maintained their wedge formations, acting as cohesive, sharp-edged units that cut through the disordered Muslim ranks like a hot knife through butter. The Hospitaller wedge, led by the furious Garnier de Nobles, cut down emirs and standard-bearers, aiming for the heart of the enemy command and shattering their ability to coordinate a response. The rout was absolute. The pride of the Ayyubid army, the conquerors of Jerusalem, fled in a blind, chaotic panic. They had no plan for this. Their entire doctrine was based on avoiding this exact scenario. Knights pursued the fleeing Muslims for miles, cutting them down without mercy until their horses were too exhausted to take another step. The killing only stopped when Richard, maintaining his strategic clarity even in the heat of victory, ordered the trumpets to sound the recall. From the first impact of the Hospitaller charge to the complete collapse and flight of Saladin's army, 17 minutes. In that impossibly short span of time, between 6,000 and 7,000 of Saladin's best troops were killed, including a significant number of his most experienced and irreplaceable emirs and commanders. The Crusaders lost around 700 men, most of them during the morning's intense harassment before the charge. The field of Arsuf was carpeted with the dead and dying, a horrifying testament to the brutal efficiency of the medieval heavy cavalry charge when perfectly executed. In the aftermath, Richard, in a move that showed his supreme strategic command, refused to allow a full, reckless pursuit. His knights and barons, intoxicated by victory, begged him to finish the job, to chase the fleeing Saladin to the very gates of Jerusalem. But the Lionheart knew his army was spent. The men were exhausted, the horses were blown, and the chain of command was stretched. A reckless pursuit into unknown territory could easily stumble into a fresh ambush or see the victorious but disordered Crusaders cut off from their supply line. Discipline had won the day. Discipline would now preserve the victory. They would continue their march to Arsuf as planned, regroup, and live to fight another day. The strategic consequences of Arsuf were immediate and profound. The road to Jaffa was now open. The city, demoralized by the news of the massacre, surrendered without a fight. The victory shattered the myth of Saladin's invincibility that had hung over the Holy Land like a pall since the disaster at Hattin. It restored the confidence and fighting spirit of the Crusader states and ensured their survival for another century. Saladin, humiliated and militarily weakened, never again risked a major pitched battle against Richard. The campaign shifted from open field combat to one of sieges, maneuvering, and eventual negotiation, which would lead to the Treaty of Jaffa, guaranteeing Christian pilgrimage access to Jerusalem. The Battle of Arsuf stands as a timeless masterclass in military command, operational art, and psychological warfare. It demonstrated that the greatest weapon is not the sharpest sword or the strongest arm, but the strongest will. Richard the Lionheart proved that patience could be a more devastating offensive tool than blind aggression. He understood his enemy's doctrine, he understood the terrain, and most importantly, he understood the psychology of his own men. He turned their suffering into a weapon, their desperation into a force multiplier. He allowed Saladin to believe he was winning, to grow overconfident, to commit his forces until the moment he had already lost. In those 17 minutes at Arsuf, the art of war was rewritten, and the name of the Lionheart was etched permanently into the annals of history. If your mind is reeling from the sheer tactical brilliance of this historical masterpiece, then you know what to do. Smash that like button because this kind of in-depth analysis takes us forever to create. Subscribe to Laugh and Learn Lab right now because we are just getting started. We dive deep into the stories that shaped our world, uncovering the secrets, the strategies, and the human drama that textbooks leave out. What other battle do you think defied all odds? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a lesson from the Laugh and Learn Lab. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.